She collapsed beside his fire with frost burning her lashes. He did not know her name, only the weight of her silence. By dawn, the ice around his cabin would remember her footsteps. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and tell us in the comments which country and city you're watching from. The man known to most fishermen as Rowan Hale had spent his winter in a lonely wooden outpost pressed against a frozen bay where the wind chewed at the walls as if testing their resolve. He had come here after losing a brother to a storm he believed he could have prevented, a failure that clung to him heavier than the furs he wore. On that night, the one that would split his fate into the ice groaned like something ancient shifting in its sleep, and Rowan was sharpening a bone hook by the fire when the door thudded once, then again, with a force that rattled the hinges. He expected wolves, or the wind playing tricks, but when he opened the door, cold air poured in carrying the figure of a towering woman who staggered forward, her height nearly eclipsing the frame as she fell at his feet. He had seen Inuit hunters before on distant journeys, but never one like her. She was at least a head taller than any he had met, broad-shouldered, wrapped in thick caribou hides, her braids stiff with ice that clung to them like shards. Her breathing was shallow, not from fear but from a cold so deep it bent even the strongest. Rowan dropped to his knees and hesitated only a moment before pulling her toward the fire, the heat blooming against her frozen clothing. She did not speak, her eyes were half closed, tracking the flames, as though deciding whether to trust them. Rowan knew enough about cold exposure to act quickly. He loosened the outer layer of her fur so the heat would reach her skin, placed warm stones wrapped in cloth near her sides, and whispered steady instructions even though he doubted she understood his language. As the ice on her lash softened into drops, he realized she was conscious, watching him with an expression carved from endurance rather than fear. She nodded once, a gesture so small compared to her size that it felt like a secret between them. Rowan turned away to give her dignity, stoking the fire until sparks snapped upward like brief stars. The cabin smelled of smoke and wet hide, and the air warmed enough to soften his own rigid fingers. He offered her a wooden cup of melted snow, and she drank slowly, her hands enormous around the small vessel. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, steady, and shaped by the land itself. She gave only her name, Akana. Her presence filled the cabin differently from any person Rowan had known. She moved with the weight of stories she did not reveal, glancing at the window as though measuring the distance to something she had left behind. Rowan sensed she was not running from danger but from exhaustion, something long endured and only now catching up. When he offered her dried fish, she accepted with a nod. When he spread an extra fur by the fire, she rested upon it without hesitation, curling slightly, though even curled she was massive, the ground creaking softly beneath her. Rowan remained awake longer than he should have, watching her breathing settle into a rhythm that reminded him of the tide under ice. Outside, the storm worsened, wind slicing past the cabin as if searching for a weakness. Rowan felt a strange calm with her there, as though the world could not harm what the fire guarded. He wondered what path had brought a hunter of her stature alone into such violent weather. Hunters this far north rarely traveled without clan. Her gear was expertly made, sealskin boots reinforced for long distances, a harpoon tip carved with family markings, a knife at her belt wrapped with wolf sinew. Whoever she belonged to must have been searching for her or mourning her absence. Yet she did not carry the fear of someone being pursued. She carried the fatigue of someone who had always been depended upon. Rowan slept lightly that night, waking at each shift of her weight, listening to the crackle of thawing ice in her clothing. Once, near dawn, he stirred to find her sitting upright, watching him. Her expression was unreadable, neither threatening nor grateful, simply present, like a glacier that accepted weather without judgment. She nodded once more, as though acknowledging something unspoken, and Rowan felt a warmth he had not known in years, a sense that someone saw him clearly. Not as a failed brother, not as a solitary fisherman, but as a man who had done one small thing right. When morning light pushed through the narrow window, Akana rose without a sound, towering enough that her shadow spread across the entire cabin floor. She tightened her braids, adjusted her hides, and stepped outside without a word. Rowan followed her into the crisp air, where the snow squeaked beneath their boots. Her gaze swept the white horizon with alarming focus, as if reading a message the land had left. She looked back at him only once, and in that look was gratitude restrained by discipline. She touched the side of his fire pit still warm from the night and then walked away, leaving deep, deliberate prints across the snowfield. Rowan watched until her silhouette blurred into the rising light. He returned to the cabin feeling something he had not felt since before his brother's death. Purpose. He did not know that Akana's quiet departure was not the end of their meeting but the beginning of a reckoning that would reshape the next hours of his life. As he prepared a simple breakfast and fed the fire again, he imagined her miles away, already reunited with her people. What he did not imagine was that she was not alone, that somewhere beyond the ridge, a signal had been sent, and a decision had been made. It was near noon when Rowan heard it, a distant rumble, like many boots compressing the snow in unison. At first, he thought it was the shifting of the ice shelf, but ice did not move with intention. The sound grew heavier, multiplied, layered with faint voices carried by the wind. Rowan stepped outside, shielding his eyes from the glare, and froze. Over the ridge, spreading across the horizon like an incoming storm, marched dozens, no, hundreds of Inuit hunters, each carrying harpoons, spears, or bows, their parkas crowned with fur that glowed under the cold sun. At the front, walking with the stride of someone who had chosen this path without hesitation, was Akana, and they were all heading straight for him. The ridge seemed to move as a single breathing organism, a long procession of fur-clad figures advancing with a discipline that made Rowan's pulse falter. Each step pressed new shadows across the snow, turning the valley from white to trembling gray. Rowan stood outside his cabin for a few seconds too long, long enough for the cold to slip beneath his collar and trace the back of his neck like a warning. He knew these were not wanderers or traders. No group this large traveled without intent. Their approach was massive, coordinated, and carried the tension of something long awaited. Rowan felt small in their presence, smaller than he had felt even during the storm that had taken his brother, because this time the threat walked on to feed and knew exactly where he stood. Akana led them with a steadiness that did not waver despite the size of the force behind her. Her fur had framed her face, but the height of her posture and the decisive rhythm of her stride made her unmistakable. Rowan had expected her to vanish into the wild like a dream carved from frost, but she had returned with a wave of people who treated the land as an extension of their own bodies. He noticed how their boots sank evenly, how no one lagged behind or rushed ahead. Years of training lived in their steps. Rowan's throat tightened. What had he done? What had he misstepped? Had warming her by the fire insulted a custom he didn't understand? As they drew closer, Rowan realized he had no place to run. The open ice offered no shelter, and the hunters were too many to hide from. The nearest one lifted a carved horn and let out a sound that echoed across the valley, vibrating in Rowan's ribs. Not an alarm, not aggression, something ceremonial, old and deliberate. The front line slowed, and Akana signaled with one raised hand. Immediately, the entire formation stopped, 200 hunters freezing mid-stride as though the wind itself had commanded them. It was the kind of silence that made Rowan's breath visible and fragile. Akana stepped forward alone, leaving the sea of hunters behind her. Her footsteps were heavy but measured, each one sinking deep into the snow, leaving prints that could swallow his entire boot. Rowan stood still, because moving felt like disrespect, and because something inside him recognized that this moment carried weight beyond fear. She stopped only a few paces away, her breath curled in the air, joining his. He noticed details he had missed the night before, the faint crack along the handle of her harpoon, the thread reinforcing a seam on her coat, the snow trapped between her braids. She was powerful, yes, but also human, cold, tired, and marked by a journey she had not chosen lightly. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than the wind, but sharper. "You warned me," she said, the words carrying a significance he didn't yet understand. Rowan nodded, unsure whether to speak. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with eyes that held neither suspicion nor softness, only truth. She stepped aside, revealing a semicircle of elders behind the ranks, men and women with lines etched deep by wind and winter. Rowan's breath caught. He realized this was not a war party. This was a council on the move. The eldest woman stepped forward. Her hair was long and silver, braided into a crown that framed her stern face. She approached Rowan slowly, her boots crunching softly. When she reached him, she glanced at Akana, then back at him, and placed a gloved hand on his shoulder. It was not a gesture of threat but of acknowledgement. Rowan felt heat rush to his face, confusion thickening his thoughts. Akana watched closely, the slightest shift in her stance hinting at something protective, though her expression remained unreadable. The elder spoke in her language, her tone steady, the syllables shaped by a lifetime of winter. Akana translated, each word clear. "Last night," she said, "you did what most men would not do. You sheltered one of our strongest when she could not stand." Rowan opened his mouth, but Akana lifted a hand, a quiet plea for him to listen. "Among our people," she continued, "warmth given in a moment of weakness binds the living to the living. It is an old rule, older than any of us." Rowan felt the weight of the explanation settle like snow on his shoulders. He had not healed her, he had not saved her life. He had simply acted because compassion demanded it. Yet to them, that simple act had meaning woven through centuries. He swallowed hard. "I didn't know," he said softly. Akana's gaze flickered, not amusement, not pity, something closer to understanding. "We know you did not," she said. "That is why we came." The elder gestured for the hunters to widen their formation. They obeyed instantly, creating a vast ring around Rowan and Akana, enclosing them inside a boundary of respect that also felt like judgment. Akana stepped closer, her shadow overlapping his. "There is a path that follows such a gesture," she said, her voice careful. "You offered warmth. Now our people must decide what warmth you receive in return." Rowan's pulse quickened. He understood then that this was not simply gratitude. It was something more binding, something dangerous if mishandled. Akana looked at him with an intensity that made the cold feel secondary. "Rowan Hale," she said, speaking his name as though she had carried it for years. "Not ours. Our people seek to understand why a stranger would act with the heart of kin." Behind her, the hunters stood silent as mountains, their breaths rising like pillars of smoke. Rowan felt the weight of 200 eyes pressing into him, not with anger, but expectation. He had no script, no lineage, no tradition to guide him, only truth. He opened his mouth to speak, but the wind rose suddenly, carrying the echo of footsteps across the ridge. The hunters shifted, eyes narrowing. Akana turned sharply. Rowan followed her gaze and froze. A second group was approaching from the opposite direction. Smaller, but fast, intentional, cutting across the snow with the precision of wolves. Akana's jaw tightened. "This," she said quietly, "was not supposed to happen today." The smaller group advanced with a speed that unsettled even the disciplined hunters surrounding Rowan. Snow rose behind them in thin spirals, kicked upward by boots that barely seemed to touch the ground. Rowan could not yet make out faces, only the rhythm of their movement, driven, urgent, coordinated in a way that signaled purpose rather than panic. Akana stepped in front of him by instinct, shoulders widening, her presence hardening like a barrier shaped from the ice itself. It was the first time she had moved protectively between him and anything beyond her tribe, and Rowan felt a rush of something he could not yet name: gratitude, fear, responsibility braided together like the threads of a winter rope. The elder signaled, and the main formation of hunters shifted subtly, half turning toward the approaching group without breaking the circular boundary around Rowan. Their discipline was astonishing, 200 bodies adjusting as one, without hesitation or visible communication. The sound of their clothing brushing together was soft, almost reverent. Rowan felt the temperature drop as a gust of wind sliced across the valley floor, carrying with it the distant clatter of equipment from the incoming travelers. Akana narrowed her eyes, and Rowan saw tension settle across her jaw, the kind of tension born from unfinished stories and unresolved boundaries. As the new arrivals reached a slope near the cluster of ice boulders, their silhouettes sharpened, 10 of them, all carrying gear built not for hunting, but for pursuit: light sleds, ropes, and tools strapped across their backs. Their parkas were embroidered with a pattern Rowan had not seen among Akana's people, though the fur trim was similar in style. These were not outsiders from foreign lands. They were another Inuit lineage, close enough to share the same winter, distant enough to have their own rules. The leader of the group raised a hand, not in greeting, but in a gesture that demanded attention. Akana exhaled slowly, like someone bracing for a conversation she had hoped to avoid. The leader of the second group stepped forward, pulling back his hood. His face was younger than Rowan expected: smooth cheeks, strong jaw, sharp eyes that reflected the snow with the brightness of steel. He stopped a few paces from Akana and spoke in a language Rowan could not fully understand, though the cadence of the words carried the tone of accusation rather than diplomacy. The air between the two groups tightened like stretched sinew. Akana did not flinch. She responded with fewer words, her tone a controlled calm that made the younger leader's shoulders tense visibly. Rowan watched, unsure how much of this tension was about him and how much belonged to disputes older than he could grasp. The younger leader's gaze slid toward Rowan with the deliberation of a knife being unsheathed. His eyes lingered on the cabin behind Rowan, on the fire pit still warm from the morning flame, then on Rowan himself, tired and shaven, out of place beside two tribes with histories rooted deeper than any map he owned. Rowan instinctively straightened, not to defend himself, but to avoid appearing afraid. Fear, he sensed, would be misread here. The young leader spoke again, voice raised, and several hunters from his group shifted their weight, gripping their tools as though expecting a command. The main tribe surrounding Rowan did not move, but the air bristled with the pressure of two converging storms. Akana raised a hand, silencing both sides. The gesture was effortless, but the obedience it commanded was unmistakable. Even the younger leader paused, his eyes darkening with reluctant respect. She stepped closer to him, their towering figures nearly aligned, and spoke in a tone that Rowan had not yet heard from her, firm, low, authoritative, but woven with a thread of something personal, as though history lay between them. The younger leader's expression flickered, betraying the smallest hint of conflict, before he looked away sharply toward the wide-open snowfield, avoiding her eyes as though her words struck deeper than he wanted Rowan to perceive. Rowan listened to the wind pushing the sound across the valley, carrying fragments he could not decipher. Yet he could read the emotion clearly. This was not merely about clan boundaries or tradition. The way the younger leader looked at Akana held the weight of someone who had once trained with her, walked beside her, or perhaps challenged her. This was the tension of equals who had made different choices. When his gaze returned to Rowan, it carried a charge sharpened by comparison. Rowan felt exposed, not physically, but existentially, standing between two legacies as the man who had offered warmth to someone who rarely accepted assistance. Finally, Akana turned toward Rowan. Her breath hung in the air as she stepped close enough for him to feel the warmth radiating through her layers of fur. "They come," she murmured, "because they believe I should not walk alone." Her voice carried a heaviness that suggested she had chosen solitude not out of rebellion, but necessity. Rowan searched her face, finding no fear, only a strain that came from being pulled between obligations and truths. "Why would walking alone be wrong?" he asked quietly. She took a slow breath, letting it frost the air between them. "Because to them, I am not allowed to fall," she said. "And last night, I did." The younger leader stepped forward sharply, as if responding to her confession, speaking quickly with urgency that Rowan could feel even without understanding the words. Akana answered with a single phrase, short, final, unshakable. The young man's jaw tightened. He gestured at Rowan with a questioning sweep of his hand, as if demanding justification, validation, or perhaps an explanation for Akana's choice to seek warmth in the shelter of a stranger. The wind caught the edge of his coat, flaring it outward like a flag of challenge. Akana's posture shifted subtly. She moved half a step closer to Rowan, not in defiance, but in acknowledgement. It was the first gesture that openly tied her to him in the eyes of both tribes. Murmurs rippled through the larger circle of hunters, barely audible yet heavy with meaning. Rowan felt his chest tighten. He had not asked for this place, this role, this collision of two clans, yet he could not step back. Something in Akana's quiet closeness anchored him to the moment, binding him to the responsibility he had never expected when he opened his cabin door the night before. The younger leader inhaled sharply and lowered his gaze, but not in surrender, in preparation. He turned to Akana, speaking words that moved like the edge of a blade, controlled, deliberate, inevitable. Akana listened without expression, then gave a single nod that seemed to cost her something. When she faced Rowan again, her eyes held a truth she had tried to shield him from. "Rowan," she said softly, "they have come to determine whether the warmth you gave me means you now stand alone with me." She let the words sink into the cold, or against all of them. For a long moment, Rowan could not find his voice. The idea that a simple act of kindness, pulling a stranger in from the edge of frostbite, sharing fire and warmth, could place him at the center of a judgment involving 200 hunters felt unreal, like a story told around someone else's fire. Yet nothing about this valley was a story to them. It was law, lived in the bone. Akana did not look away as his breathing quickened, as his gaze flicked from her broad shoulders to the silent ring of faces surrounding them. The wind moved between bodies, rearranging strands of fur, lifting tendrils of steam from hot breaths. It seemed to be the only thing allowed to move freely. The elder woman stepped forward again, her silver braids catching a faint glint of pale sun. She spoke with a calm that contrasted sharply with the tension in the younger leader's posture. Akana translated slowly, choosing her words with precision, as if she knew that the way Rowan heard this would shape what he believed about the moment for the rest of his life. Among our people, she said, those who receive warmth at the edge of breaking do not forget. We do not let it become a thing without weight. We have rules for it. Rowan swallowed, his throat suddenly dry despite the cold. What rules? He asked quietly. Akana's gaze didn't waver. If a stranger offers warmth without demand, she said, we ask, did he see a person? Or did he see only a tool, a body, a legend? The younger leader spoke then, his tone clipped, his eyes never leaving Rowan's face. Akana's jaw tightened slightly before she translated. He believes, she said, that no one helps a hunter like me without wanting something back, a story, protection, advantage. The accusation hung in the air, not shouted but embedded like a hook beneath the skin. Rowan's chest tightened. Memories rushed up of his brother's last night at sea, of the storm warning he had tried to ignore, of the guilt that had driven him to this outpost, away from people so he could fail no one again. I wanted nothing, Rowan said, his voice low but steady. I saw someone who would have died alone outside my door. The younger leader responded sharply, his expression skeptical, as if the very idea of acting without self-interest was a luxury he could not afford to believe in. Akana listened, then turned to Rowan and stepped closer, her height casting him in partial shadow. They cannot take only your words, she said softly, so that only he could hear. They will need to see how you stand when something is asked of you. Her breath brushed his cheek, warm against the frozen air. That is how we measure truth. The elder raised a hand, and the ring of hunters tightened, by a single pace inward, not a threat, but a closing of focus. The younger leader gestured toward the open ice, where the base stretched out in a mosaic of ridges and fractures. He spoke in short, decisive sentences. Akana's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Rowan saw anger flicker beneath her controlled exterior. She argued back, her voice still low but sharpened, pointing once toward Rowan's cabin, then toward the distant line where the sea ice met open water. The exchange was fast, taut, pulling unseen strings between them. Finally, she exhaled through her teeth, a small cloud of defeat shaped like compromise. She turned to Rowan, wearing the expression of someone about to place a heavy pack on a tired man's shoulders. They call for a hunt, she said. Not for meat, for truth. Rowan frowned. A hunt, she nodded. Out there, she gestured to the jagged expanse of ice, the seals have shifted. The ice is thinner. It is dangerous for anyone who walks without knowing how to listen to it. They want to see if you will walk that danger beside me when there is nothing in it for you but risk. If you do, they will believe your fire last night was clean. If you refuse. Her voice trailed off, but the unspoken conclusion pressed against his ribs like cold stone. He looked at the ice field. He was no stranger to treacherous surfaces. His life on boats had taught him to read water, waves, and currents. But ice was a different language, its betrayals quieter, sudden, harder to predict. He flexed his fingers inside his gloves, feeling the prickle of fear. If I die out there, he said, attempting a thin edge of humor that didn't quite reach his eyes, will it at least prove my sincerity? Akana did not smile, but something in her gaze softened. If you die out there, she said, they will say you walked the truth of your fire to the end. But I will not let that happen. The final sentence was delivered not as a promise to comfort him, but as a fact she had already folded into her own responsibility. The younger leader stepped between them and pointed toward the horizon where thin mist hovered above darker patches of ice leads, cracks, places where the sea breathed through its frozen skin. He then touched his chest, then pointed at Akana, then at Rowan. 3. There was no mistaking the meaning. Only they would go. The rest would stay as witnesses, figures on the edge of an unwritten law. Akana's shoulders rose and fell in a slow breath. He will walk with us, she translated. He wants to see if I am choosing a man who understands the ice, or one who brings only fire. Rowan felt the old ache of grief stir like a warning. The last time he had underestimated danger, his brother had vanished beneath black water. The guilt had driven him here, to solitude, to silence. And yet, when he looked at Akana, this giant huntress who had collapsed at his threshold and trusted his hands at her most vulnerable, he understood that refusing now would mean repeating the same abandonment in a different form. Walking away, while someone else shouldered the risk alone. He had promised himself he would not fail another life if he could stand between them and harm. The promise wrapped around his fear and squeezed until a decision emerged, raw and clear. He nodded once. "I'll go," he said. The words felt like stepping off an edge. Akana held his gaze for a long heartbeat, then nodded back, something fierce sparking in her eyes, a mix of respect, relief, and a burden she had not wanted to place on him but now shared. The younger leader watched with a complex expression, torn between disdain and the grudging recognition given to those who step willingly into danger. He signaled to the hunters, and they parted, opening a narrow path toward the ice field, as if revealing a new corridor of fate. As Rowan and Akana walked side by side down that path, the air between them thickened with a silence that was not empty. She adjusted the straps of her gear, then glanced at him. "You walk like a man who has already faced drowning," she said quietly. He looked at her, surprised by the accuracy. "I have," he answered. "And I failed the one who didn't make it back to the surface." She studied him for a moment, then spoke with slow care. "Then today, when the ice speaks, you will hear it." Men who know loss listen differently. The statement settled in him like a hand on his back, steadying, not pushing. They stepped off the firm snow and onto the first stretch of rough ice. It creaked beneath their boots, low and complaining. Rowan instinctively shifted his weight, spacing his steps, watching for changes in color and texture. Akana observed his adjustments with quiet approval. Behind them, 200 hunters and 10 more from the rival group stood as still as carved stone, their eyes fixed on the trio moving toward the uncertain underbelly of the bay. Every sound, the crack of distant ice, the sigh of wind, the faint groan of shifting plates seemed amplified, as if the land itself had leaned in to witness. Rowan inhaled the sharp air and realized something profound had shifted inside him. This was no longer just about proving his intentions to people he had met only hours ago. It was about whether he still believed in himself as someone capable of standing in the right place when it mattered. He looked at Akana, her massive frame cutting a confident path ahead, and felt an almost unbearable respect, not for her strength alone, but for the weight she carried, being the one who was not supposed to fall, who now risked falling alongside him. As they approached the first dark vein of thinner ice, Akana lifted a gloved hand, signaling him to stop. The younger leader stepped to the other side, 3 figures now spaced along the crack-like markers in a story that had not yet chosen its ending. Akana crouched, pressing her ear to the ice, listening to the deep murmurs beneath. Rowan watched her, sensing that whatever happened next would either bind him to this woman in a way that would change his life forever, or break the fragile trust their brief night of shared warmth had created. The wind quieted, as if the world wanted to hear her verdict. Akana rose slowly, met Rowan's eyes, and spoke in a voice meant only for him. "From here on," she said, "every step you take will tell them who you really are." The ice ahead was a mosaic of whites and muted blues, streaked with fractures that reflected the pale sky in trembling mirrors. Rowan stepped behind Akana, matching her pace, placing his boots exactly where hers had pressed the surface moments before. Each step carried a quiet threat, a reminder that the world beneath them could shift without warning, that solid ground was never truly promised in a place where the sea only pretended to sleep. The younger leader moved to Rowan's left, studying him with the sharp alertness of someone waiting for a reason to declare him unfit. At times he walked ahead, other times he lingered behind, but never far, like an argument walking beside them, refusing to be settled. Akana crouched again, her ear grazing the ice. Rowan watched her steady posture, her control, the way she absorbed the distant groans beneath their feet as if they were spoken words. She pressed her palm flat on the surface, reading temperature, vibration, tension. Rowan remembered the last storm he had faced with his brother, how he had ignored the subtle shift in the air, the unnatural silence that preceded the wind's fury. Akana, however, did not ignore anything. Every detail mattered. Loss had taught Rowan to fear his instincts, but walking behind her taught him something different. Instincts are sharpened not by certainty, but by humility. When they reached a wide patch of thin ice, Akana motioned for Rowan to approach. The younger leader steadied his stance, watching for hesitation. Rowan exhaled, tasting salt mixed with cold, and stepped forward. The ice hummed beneath him, a quiet vibration that radiated across his solace. He crouched carefully, pressing his glove to the surface, feeling a trembling pulse beneath. The sound reminded him of the tide pushing against the hull of his brother's boat, the one he had promised to repair, but never did. Guilt tightened his chest. He leaned closer, listening, waiting. The trembling shifted, subtle but clear, toward the left, where snow had drifted into a deceptive white blanket over a thin sheet. Rowan rose slowly, pointed left, and said, "Not here. It won't hold." Akana studied him, her expression unreadable but attentive. The younger leader stepped onto the area Rowan had indicated and felt the ice shift under his weight, a faint lurch, a warning. He stepped back immediately, eyes narrowing, not at Rowan but at the accuracy. Akana nodded once. She did not smile, but something warm flickered in her gaze, a quiet validation that felt heavier than any spoken praise. Rowan felt a breath release inside him, not relief, but recognition. He had not misread the world this time. They continued forward in a triangle formation, Akana leading, Rowan slightly behind her, the younger leader to the side. Their breath rose in thin clouds. Their steps fell into rhythm. After a long stretch of silence, Akana spoke softly, without breaking her stride. "You listen like a man who has carried grief long enough to know the cost of ignoring small sounds." Rowan looked at her, the weight of her words settling into the quiet space between them. "Grief makes everything louder," he said. "Even the things no one else hears." She nodded, her braids shifting slightly with the movement. "It is why you opened your door last night," she said. "Not because you wanted something, because you know what it means to lose someone who should have been saved." The younger leader heard this but did not interrupt. His gaze softened for the first time. Rowan sensed he was beginning to see him not as an intruder but as someone shaped by winter in his own way. Still, the test was not finished. The ice had thickened into a ridge, and Akana climbed it with ease, her boots gripping the uneven surface. Rowan followed, but slipped briefly when the right edge gave way. Akana's hand shot out immediately, large and firm, catching his coat before he lost balance. Her strength pulled him upright in one smooth motion. For a moment, their breaths mingled, warm air meeting cold. She released him only when he found his footing again. The younger leader watched closely, not with judgment, but with acknowledgement. At the top of the ridge, the wind opened into a wide plain where the ice was thicker, safer. Akana motioned for them to stop. The hunters in the distance stood like a dark crown on the white horizon, unmoving, waiting for the verdict carved by the three figures on the ice. Rowan felt exposed, but not alone. Akana walked to his side, her presence a shield that did not block the wind but softened its bite. The younger leader approached, his face calm, his posture no longer rigid with suspicion. He spoke first, his voice steady but no longer sharp. Akana translated. "He says your steps did not lie. That the ice listened to you because you listened first." Rowan swallowed, unexpected emotion rising in his throat. The younger leader continued, softer now. Akana hesitated for a moment before translating the rest. "He says, he understands why I walked into the storm alone. And why I walked to your door." Rowan looked at Akana, the confession weaving itself quietly into the cold between them. She held his gaze, and he saw something he had not expected: relief. Not that he had passed their test, but that she was no longer forced to carry the weight of explaining herself. Together, the three began the return across the ice, their steps no longer tense or divided. As they approached the waiting tribes, Akana moved closer to Rowan, her arm brushing his in a gesture that felt deliberate, grounding, almost protective. The hunters watched them descend the final slope. The elder stepped forward again, her face illuminated by the pale sun. She examined Rowan not with suspicion but with a solemn respect earned through silence and risk. She spoke, and Akana translated with a voice steadier than before. "You warmed one of ours. Today, she walked with you to see if your fire carried truth." The elder's eyes softened. It did. A low murmur passed through the hunters' agreement, acceptance, the settling of a judgment. The younger leader bowed his head briefly to Rowan, then stepped back into his formation. Rowan exhaled a breath he felt he had carried since before dawn. Akana remained beside him, her shadow long and steady across the snow. She spoke quietly, so only he could hear. "Last night, you kept me alive. Today, you kept your word to yourself." Rowan looked at her, the cold stinging his eyes. "And what now?" he asked. Akana lifted her gaze toward the vast expanse of white, where the horizon blurred into sky. "Now," she said, you walk with us. Not because you must, because you chose to. She extended a hand toward him, not a gesture of ownership or claim, but of shared path, shared winter, shared consequence. Rowan took it, feeling the warmth of her palm through the thick glove, a warmth deeper than fire, and together they stepped forward as the hunters parted, accepting them both into a place neither had expected to find, a place where warmth, once given freely, returned not as debt, but as belonging.